Yeah, thanks for all those that showed up to clean. It looks great. I noticed it right away. Well, like Bill said, my name is Kent Wieber. I am not one of the pastors here. I couldn't wait to say that. So I am actually in the mission field. I'm a public school teacher. Is that not a mission field? Yeah, I've been in Ben Lapine for 21 years now, and I actually brought my lectern from my classroom so I would feel more comfortable. And it even helps that some of my former students are out there, and I see Hannah and Sam. You guys are here, so that's good. Hey, you weren't supposed to say that. Shh. And Jeff and Lisa, your guys' kids made it through with not too many scars. So, yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy this. I was wondering if there's like a gong somewhere. If I'm doing a bad job, you guys hit the gong. But I can't remember anyone ever gonging Drew, probably because he's never had a bad one. So, I don't know. Maybe there's like somebody has one of those hooks or something to pull me off the stage. And then I was sitting there and I was looking at this. And I'm like, you know what? I know what it is. It's a button somewhere, and they push the button, and that basket just comes right down. Boom! I'm off the stage. So, all right. Well, we're in a series called Heroes. And is my slide up? Yep. Let me get this one caught up. And we've been looking at some great people in history. Some are in the Bible, some are not. All have been men and women of faith who relied on their faith and God's power to accomplish great things. They're not perfect people, but people who can inspire us with their character and their wisdom and their courage to do the right thing. I'm wondering if some of you have some favorites that you've come across so far. Would anyone be brave enough to tell us who their favorite was and why? I know, this is like my classroom. Jeez. Okay, now, yeah, I'm glad somebody, because this is like the only kinesthetic part of my lesson, so. Randy?
Well, I had a couple of them. I think the one that kind of really related is Milliken, the guy who brought Billy Graham to Christ, introduced him, and it just showed that what each of us, the impact that each of us can have that we may not know we have. So, pretty important.
Thank you. Anybody else? Patty?
Corrie ten Boom. Yeah. Thinking about her and the fleas, that the worst of the worst, and she got through that, and it was still a blessing.
Amazing woman. Last chance. All right. Who was here for Jackie Robinson? Wasn't that amazing? I'll tell you what, let's do this. On the count of 3, let's just shout out who your favorite has been. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, and then you guys just shout it out, since some of you are too shy to get on the mic. All right, here we go. On the count of 3, think of it right now. 1, 2, 3. All right, I heard a variety of them. That's good. Excellent. Well, we're going to continue that. And we could call all these heroes of the faith. They came, persevered, and now they're cheering for us. Have you ever thought about that? Look at Hebrews chapter 12. Let's even read the slide. Next slide, yeah. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Isn't that comforting to know that those who've gone before us are cheering for us? We will see at the end of this lesson an anecdotal reminder that should excite us as we head into the new year. Today's heroine lived in 5th century BC Persia under the reign of King Xerxes. Look at the extent of this kingdom. It goes all the way from India across, spilling into Europe and down into Africa. It's the largest the world had ever seen at that point. And Xerxes, the king, had several palaces. His summer fortress was in Persepolis, right there. Any guesses who this heroine might be? I heard some of them. Yeah, he wintered in the beautiful city of Susa where the book of Esther takes place. So today we're going to learn about Esther. You see, she's a woman of strength and dignity. Some of the points that I make in this lesson I get from the book by Chuck Swindoll, and you can see his subtitle there. We're also going to learn that one way for God's fame to spread is that by the testimony of his people. And Esther was willing to risk her life during such a time as this. Let's look at the key figures in this story, and we'll just read them off the slide. King Xerxes, Queen Vashti, Mordecai, Esther, and Haman. And let's examine King Xerxes first. At this time, he was considered the most powerful man on earth. Archaeologists have discovered a palace of considerable magnificence, extravagance, and lavishness. The foundation stone they dug up confirmed Xerxes' title and his territory claims. It begins, look at this slide. Next slide. Look at what they found on this stone. It says, I am Xerxes, the great king, the only king, the king of all, and on and on and on. You get the picture. He was modest, wasn't he? Yeah. Now, his queen, Vashti, was put in an uncomfortable situation. And you see that I included both names there because Xerxes is his Persian name, and then Ahasuerus, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, don't quote me on that, that's the Hebrew name. And you'll notice that Esther also has a Hebrew name, Hadassah, but we use Esther, her Persian name. But Vashti was put in an uncomfortable position at the end of 6 months of hosting parties at the palace. King Xerxes had invited officials, and business was certainly conducted over this 6 months, but there was also a lot of partying each night. He would throw these lavish, they separated them by gender too. So Queen Vashti had her group, and then the king had his group. The Greek historian Herodotus says that the visiting princes were also entertained, and in the end, they were persuaded to participate with Xerxes during the invasion of Thermopylae, Greece. And if you know your history, that's where they fought, where 300 Spartans in Greece were able to fight off tens of thousands of Persians, and it took forever for Xerxes to win that battle. But this is where it was planned. And after the 180 days were over, the king culminated the event with 7 days of unrestrained revelry. Let's read the slide from chapter 1, verse 10. It says, on the 7th day, when the king was in high spirits, he commanded his eunuchs to bring the queen before him, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. And so this was after this 6 months, where it's like, okay, business is done, we've settled everything, and let's just party. And so he had these 7 days. No amount of food or wine was withheld. No greater exhibition of wealth or generosity of their king could be imagined. During this opulent display, the king, in search of an ever more impressive display of his wealth and power, summoned the queen. All right, ladies, how many of you are going to show up for this? If that's your husband and he's snockered and he just wants to show you off, are you really going to come? Well, let's see. Look at the next slide, verse 12. Vashti refuses. When the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. You don't refuse the king back then. That's not the culture. And so he actually had experts brought in to decide what to do with the queen since she had disobeyed the king's command. They decided that the queen could be setting a precedent, and therefore they needed to make a statement. Remember, this is a secular kingdom. There is no God's law. It is the king alone. It's an autocratic type of government. They do not treat their wife as a priceless vessel. Men did not sacrifice themselves for their wives as Christ did for the church. We're 500 years before Christ. So they sent out a decree to all the parts of the kingdom proclaiming that every man should be the ruler over his own household, without question. So Vashti was sent out to never return. We're talking dictator in charge. And that's what happened to Queen Vashti. His attendants could see that the king was depressed. He eventually remembers Vashti, and the attendants decide, you know what? We need to have a search for a beautiful queen, a young virgin that's going to lift the spirits of our king. And so they did this search throughout the land. It wasn't a community dance or a ball. There wasn't a glass slipper involved. It took time for this decree to make it throughout the empire and for the girls to come to Susa. So the king's attendants had a beauty pageant like no other. Once the women from around the provinces were rounded up, they completed 12 months of beauty treatments. 6 months with oil and myrrh, 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. Then the girls would be selected one at a time to go to the king. They could take anything they wanted from the harem. They could go in the evening and return in the morning. She would not return to the king unless he was summoned by name. Guess who the winner was? Here she comes, Miss Persia. Esther is selected by the king. This orphan girl, this Jewish girl, who's being raised by her cousin, Mordecai. She wins. The original text describes her as beautiful in form and lovely to look at. Chapter 2 describes the events. Esther was entrusted to the king's top attendant, Haggai, who was in charge of the whole harem during this whole ordeal, and the girl pleased him. He provided her with beauty treatments and food. He also assigned her 7 maids to attend to her, and Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. He had a crown made and gave a great banquet in her honor. He invited all of the nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday in her honor and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Notice the last bullet on the screen. She keeps her Hebrew heritage a secret as instructed by Mordecai, and that's going to be key to what happens in the future. All right, let's learn about another key figure, Mordecai, her guardian. He's been instrumental in raising Esther. He will be nearby her throughout this whole process. In chapter 2, he's even elevated to a higher position and allowed to sit at the king's gate after Esther is selected to be queen. Turns out that's a good thing because he's in the right place at the right time. While there, 2 of the king's officers guarded the doorway to the palace. Mordecai overheard them talking and found out they were plotting to murder Xerxes. He told Queen Esther, who reported it to the king, who then gave credit to Mordecai. Once the report was investigated and found to be true, those 2 guards were hung. This was recorded in the annals in the presence of the king. Now, Persian law requires a 3-step process, so that's just the first step. Once an accusation has been proved, or it has to be proven. If disproven, the innocent party was to be compensated. If guilty, then punishment would fit the crime. And in this case, treason, punishment was death. Then step 3 was to reward the plaintiff. For some reason, the king overlooked Mordecai's reward. This was an injustice, but we will later see God's hand is in this. All right, our next key figure and our last one for this lecture is Haman. Let's read the slide about Haman. Haman is a wealthy, influential officer in the court of the king. He occupied the second highest position in the kingdom. And the king was so fond of Haman that he promoted him to this position and gave him all kinds of honors. One of those was that he commanded all of his people to also bow down for Haman. They would kneel at the gate and pay honor to him, for the king had commanded this. Mordecai alone refused to bow when Haman passes by, and this infuriates Haman. Then the royal officials at the gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but Mordecai refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it and told him he was a Jew. So let's look at chapter 3, verse 7 through 15, just a part of it. There's a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all your provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry this out. The plot has been hatched. The king took his signet ring and gave it to Haman, saying, "Do what you need to these people." Haman sent out a dispatch with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews. The order would be carried out on the 13th day in the 12th month. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes and put on a sackcloth and ashes, sprinkled ashes all over himself. He was in mourning. There was great mourning, weeping, and wailing among the Jews. This is a big cultural difference between the East and the West. Here in the West, our sorrow and grief is restrained. I remember seeing pictures of JFK's funeral and Jackie wearing black, and her grief was restrained. Obviously, she was dying inside. Her husband had been killed right next to her, but she didn't show it. She stood there, stoic. That's kind of how we handle it. But in the East, it's different. Sorrow has always been expressed visibly and vocally. Have you guys seen these pictures of when there's like a bomb that goes off and things out there, and they carry the casket through the street? They scream and they cry. This is what Mordecai is doing here. He holds nothing back, to the point that Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and told her. Let's look at Esther's response. She's not allowed to speak to Mordecai directly, so she sends clothing to replace his sackcloth as a way of offering comfort. Mordecai refuses. He's mourning. So Esther sends one of the king's servants to find out the truth. Now, think about the significant impact of one. Here is Esther. She's at a crossroads. What will she do? Have you thought of the ramifications if she exposes herself? She could die. She's married to the richest, most powerful man on earth. I wonder what she's going to do. Think of the military battles that have turned on the axis of one heroic person. Think of the artists and the contributions of their individual lives, from Michelangelo and Da Vinci to Beethoven. Think of the scientists, the inventors, the explorers, the texperts who have literally changed the course of history. And in our series, think of the courageous preachers and missionaries that have stood alone in the gap and made a difference. Men like Augustine, Calvin, Whitefield, he was one of my favorites, Spurgeon, Graham, only to name a few. Or look at it from a different angle. Think of the difference only one vote can make. Look at this, just a little snapshot of history of what one vote has meant at different places and times of our history. In 1645, one vote gave Cromwell control of England. In 1776, did you guys know we almost made German our official language? It was down to one vote. King George was German. He was the English king, but he was from Germany. That was one of our issues. In 1845, one vote brought Texas into the Union. In 1868, one vote saved President Johnson from impeachment. And in 1923, one vote gave Hitler control of the Nazi Party. Can you imagine if you didn't vote and you saw what happened later? Wow. In 1941, one vote saved the selective service system just 12 weeks before Pearl Harbor. Without that one vote, we would have not been ready to enter that war. And how many times in our lives do we say, my vote doesn't matter? Or how about this one? I can't make a difference. I find myself saying that all the time. Or I'm not good enough. I mention these examples because we're going to see that Esther risks her life to do God's will. She echoes future New Testament words in Acts chapter 20, 24. I consider my life worth nothing to me. My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task Lord Jesus has given me. Let's get back to Esther's race. Mordecai expects her to plead with the king and beg for mercy. I mean, she's married to him. She should do this. The problem that Esther has is that everyone associated with the protocol inside the palace understands that one does not go to the king. The king has to summon thee. If someone risks going to the king and he hasn't summoned you and he doesn't hold out his scepter for you to proceed, you could be put to death. That is how serious this proposition is. Esther existed to please her master, and he decided when and where to take pleasure in her. That was the culture. To presume to enter the king's presence uninvited produced an automatic sentence of death. The king had struck the crown of one queen's head when failing to come when commanded. Remember the party after the 7 days, Queen Vashti? He could easily remove another for this. Esther was being invited to join a select group of people, those who would lay down their lives for others. Look at Mordecai's wisdom. This chapter and verse is one of those that ranks, for me, it ranks right up there with like John 3:16 or Genesis 1:1. I remember when I was a kid, my dad was a deacon in the church, and they were having this argument about what was the most important verse in the Bible. And I was just a teenager, but I remember this going on, and I was kind of curious why they would be arguing about such a thing. And then I remember thinking, wait a minute, what about Genesis 1:1? In the beginning, God. That kind of says it all. If we could get that right. But this verse, this ranks up there with that. Listen to these words. Mordecai says to Esther, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will rise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Mordecai fully understands that Esther is only an instrument in the Lord's hand. It is the hand, not the instrument, that will deliver. Knowledge brings with it responsibility. The moment Esther becomes aware of the need, she became accountable for her actions. This simple truth has profound implications. The proclamation of the gospel increases the culpability of mankind. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, says Acts chapter 17, verse 30. We are never indispensable in God's plan, but we are always responsible for our obedience to it. So let's look at what Esther decided to do. Here's her reply. she sends her reply to Mordecai. She says in verse 16, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law." Esther's wise enough and humble enough to know that this great venture will prosper only if it is indeed the will of God. Look at the last part of that verse. She says in verse 16, "And if I perish, I perish." Wow. In every crisis, our trust in God must go beyond care for our personal safety and well-being. We must commit to doing what is right simply because it is right, whatever the possible outcome. A similar commitment is recorded in Daniel chapter 3. How many of you recognize this story? King Nebuchadnezzar has set up a gigantic idol, erected and commanded all of his subjects to bow down and worship it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego served not man, but the true God, and refused. Threatened with being cast into the fiery furnace, their response was, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." That's amazing. That reminds me, do you see the similar wording there? If I perish, I perish. God will save us, but if he does not. Very similar wording was used and recognized during World War II in the miracle of Dunkirk. Did anyone see the movie that just came out? I'm curious. I have not, but I wonder if they put this in the movie. When it became apparent that the British troops were trapped up against the English Channel with the Nazis closing in, they radioed to England saying how dire their situation was and how they needed rescued now, but if not. That's how they ended the transmission. The words were recognized as being from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The receiver recognized the dire situation and communicated the emergency that led to the miracle at Dunkirk. Was it in the movie? No. Dang it. That's why we need Christian filmmakers, huh? But here's our faith connection. Do you see the position of faith when one gets to the point that they say, "But if not, if I perish, I perish"? It is pure hope and perspective that becomes so freeing because we are essentially saying, "Lord, not my will, but your will." Talk about being free. Talk about letting go of your burden. I'm only a willing servant. Christ will see this through. Therefore, we can have peace because we know who wins the race in the end. So let's open up our Bibles for just a bit and look through at some of these heroes, and then we'll get back to wrap up this piece from Esther. So we're going to go to Hebrews chapter 11. If you have your phone, you can find that pretty easily. And we're not going to read all of it. I'm just going to bounce around. But looking at verse 1, it says, "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice. By faith he was commended as a righteous man. Look at Enoch. By faith he was taken from this life. Jump down to Noah. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not seen. Jump down to Abraham. By faith, Abraham and Sarah. By faith. Verse 13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. Verse 20, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob. By faith, Joseph. By faith, Moses. You get the picture? Yeah, let's go all the way to the very end of that chapter, verses 39. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. And then chapter 12, which we read at the beginning. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out before us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus. Does anybody remember a guy on ABC's Wide World of Sports named Bud Greenspan? Does that name sound familiar? Remember the ABC Wide World of Sports where they would do the joy of victory and then the agony of defeat? And there was that guy coming down the ski hill. Yeah. Whew. Yeah, I hurt thinking about that. I mean, he goes over a jump. He's still going 50 miles an hour, probably even after he's wrecked. Those guys go 70 plus down those mountains and then finally into a fence. Well, Bud Greenspan wrote a book about the greatest moments in sports. And one of those moments comes from the 1968 Olympics, and it's called The Last Man in the Marathon. John Stephen Akarwi had been injured during the marathon while trying to win the gold medal. He kept on running, though. Let's join the video and see a highlight of this race. It's about a 2-minute video.
At the 1968 Mexico City Marathon, 3 men earned the right to stand on the victory platform, the winners of the gold, silver, and bronze Olympic medals. But for some, the reward is a personal one, the knowledge that they finished what they set out to do. A little over an hour after the winner of the marathon crossed the finish line, John Stephen Akwari of Tanzania approaches the stadium, the last man to complete the journey. A voice calls from within to go on, and so he goes on. Afterwards, it was written, "Today we have seen a young African runner who symbolizes the finest in the human spirit, a performance that gives true dignity to sport, a performance that lifts sport out of the category of grown men playing at games, a performance that gives meaning to the word courage." Perhaps the words of John Stephen Akwari epitomize all that is right in the human spirit. When asked why he did not quit, he said simply, "My country did not send me 5,000 miles to start the race. They sent me 5,000 miles to finish the race." The light in this Tanzanian runner is a beacon to us all.
Did you hear what John said to the reporter? My country didn't send me here to start the race. Sent me here to finish the race. Isn't that what God has called us to do? And we have a great cloud of witnesses cheering us on, just like John Stephen did in the arena. As we enter those tough corners in that final stretch, can you hear Moses saying, "Go for it. You can do it. I didn't think I could make it through 40 years in the desert, but by the grace of God, I did. Abraham exhorts us, Sarah and I became parents after age 100. We didn't think it was possible, but by the grace of God, you can do it. And Esther's quiet courage proclaims, who knows but that you have come for such a time as this? Wherever you are at in this coming new year, will you remain silent? Esther did not, and her people were saved. She is one of those cloud of witnesses calling down to us. You can do it. Finish the race. Let's pray.